Hi, everyone. Welcome to our training today. My name is Alexandra Smith, and my pronouns are she, her. I am the Communications and Training Specialist here at NC CASA, and I'll be in the space to provide any sort of tech support you need today. I see my coworker, Courtney Dunkerton, is also in the space with us. And our lovely intern, Hannah Dean, is also here. So thank you, everyone, for being here. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Olga.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. Hi, everyone. So I hear the weather in your neck of the woods is pretty good. We are very excited with our weather today. It is 33 degrees and sunny out. And that's exciting when you live in the frozen tundra of Wisconsin. So totally jealous of your weather. Anyway, thanks so much for joining. My name's Olga Trujillo, and if you haven't been on one of our webinars before, I've been doing a series of different webinars around a number of communities that are historically marginalized, and so I realized that there seemed to be an interest in talking and learning more about serving people with disabilities and deaf survivors. So I'm doing today a basic training on serving survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors, but and that's to try to kind of get everybody at the foundation level. And then there's a ton of resources at my other job, which is at the Vera Institute of Justice. And if you have any questions along the way, please enter it into the chat, or if you want to unmute, you can unmute. And Alexandra, will you help me keep track of the chat? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to walk through a PowerPoint presentation. There's one little video in it, which is actually, I love this video. I'm hoping that the internet speeds between my place and your place, you're going to be able to see it okay. But I also sent the PowerPoint to Alexandra, and you can distribute that to the people who registered. Alexandra, okay. So, and also my email is on the first slide. So if you have any questions, any kind of follow-up stuff, we can, you can contact me, and I'm happy to meet with you. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Oh, just in case you're new to our webinars. So my pronouns are they, them, and I identify as a person with disability, and I tell people what my disability is in large part because I want to destigmatize it. So I have what's called dissociative identity disorder. And if you've never heard of it before, it used to be known as multiple personality disorder. So if at any point, and I've done a number of workshops, webinars on DID for the North Carolina Coalition, and they have those recordings, which you can get access to if you want to learn more, and you can email me or ask questions during this webinar. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen. All right, so I have a lot of material today. I'm going to try just to go through it at a normal pace, not rush. If I start running out of time, I'm going to skip some of the slides and then kind of make sure that I cover what you can do, just so you have that. And then remember, you'll have access to this PowerPoint. Okay, so my email is on this slide, which is olga@olgatrujillo.com. And let's see. Okay, so let's get started. I have slides that tell me everything I want to know, so I start jumping ahead. Okay, so our training goals is, so we're going to summarize what is known about victimization of people with disabilities. including sexual assault and domestic violence. We're going to discuss survivors with disabilities experiences with healing services and civil and criminal justice systems. And we're going to discuss some of the common barriers that survivors with disabilities face and identify some concrete and practical steps that you can take to enhance responses and supports to survivors with disabilities. So that's our goals of what we're going to do today. So hopefully I will do all that. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be kind of covering the basics just to make sure that we all have a foundation. Okay, so what we know is that 1 in 4 people living in the United States have at least one disability, and that's a really current number. It used to be 1 in 5, and this number just came out in November of 2021 with a new report released by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And disability is an incredibly broad category. It covers cognitive disabilities, developmental, physical, psychiatric, sensory. It includes visible and hidden disabilities. So for example, my disability of DID is a psychiatric and a hidden disability. You wouldn't know I had it unless you knew, unless I told you. So cognitive disabilities include people with Down syndrome, traumatic brain injuries, autism, and dementia. Developmental disabilities include a diverse group of chronic conditions such as fetal alcohol syndrome, cerebral palsy, intellectual disabilities that are diagnosed prior to the age of 18 and persist over the course of a lifetime. And physical disabilities include limitations in physical functioning, mobility, dexterity, or stamina, such as MS, loss of limbs, quadriplegia. Those are some, I think, kind of good examples of some that are. And then psychiatric disabilities include personality disorders, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. When you consider psychiatric disabilities, I think the number of people with disabilities is actually higher than 1 in 4, especially when you think about the past couple years and how much anxiety and depression people are experiencing as a result of the pandemic and all sorts of other challenging things that we're experiencing in our world. And then sensory disabilities are visual and hearing disabilities, and any disability related to sight, hearing, smell, touch, taste, or spatial awareness. And that categories are not mutually exclusive. Invisible disabilities are those that may seem hidden. For example, someone with hearing loss may have the tiniest hearing aid and you may not realize that they have any sort of disability. Neurological conditions a lot of times are not visible. And like I said, a lot of psychiatric disabilities are also hidden. Okay, disability is ordinary. The diagnosis does not predict an individual's experience. Not all people who have disabilities identify as having one. So let me give you an example. So I was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder when I was 31 years old. I am now 60, and it's only been, and I've lived with it, since I was 3, not knowing I had it. So I lived with it for most of my life, and only really in the last, I want to say 5-6 years, have I identified as a person with a disability. I think I just never thought about it before. But then I realized that, so the things that, and we probably all do this, the things that I find challenging about moving through the world, like having a job and how I get along in a workplace, being able to travel, being able to go to places I don't know, to do trainings and technical assistance, site visits, all that stuff. All those things are kind of normal parts to a job. And I just kind of figured out how to do it, but it's always been pretty challenging. And only in the past 5-6 years have I thought about myself as having a disability to the point of centering it in my work so that I can ask for accommodations, so that I can do my work more efficiently, if that makes sense. Like, so that I don't have to hide what it is that I do inside all the time. And I think a lot of people are like this. I mean, a lot of people in our field have experienced trauma, and they'll have post-traumatic stress disorder that'll show up at work in ways that are similar to the way my DID shows up at work. And we just kind of deal with it. We don't identify as someone who might have a disability. And then we, or at least what I did was, I thought it was just me, like there was a deficiency in me. And that's part, I think, of the reason that I didn't connect to it as a disability, because I think I've thought about disability as being less than. And because our society is so ableist, I internalize being different because of having DID as being less than. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there, because I think a lot of us have this experience, and we're not, then we're kind of like white knuckling it, kind of, trying to get through to do what we need to do without asking for help in ways that would make us more efficient, effective, and also to be able to enjoy what we do more. So, okay, so I just wanted to give you an example of like how not everybody thinks that they have a disability, if they, but they might actually have one. The experience of women with disabilities is shaped by ableism. And I think that example that I gave you about how, like, how I've always thought of myself, like I've tried to match what the other people that I work with do, and deal with what happens inside my body and inside my mind on my own. And that's how ableism shows up. So I then internalize that feeling of less than, and that I can't let people know how I'm different. I just have to do what other people do and go through the machinations of that. So anyway, so that's what I'm saying about kind of how ableism shows up. And then also the way that we've kind of, the evolution of how we talk about people with disabilities is people first language. And actually, so it's, so a person is a person first, and then a person with a disability second, if that makes sense. Now, there is a move going, there are a lot of people with disabilities that are moving away from the people first language and doing identity first language, which means like, so they'll refer to themselves as someone who is disabled, a disabled person, autistic. I had a woman that I met with, that I facilitated a webinar with, and she described herself as being mad, and I loved it. And she said, mad with the capital M, I'm mad. And meaning that she had a psychiatric disability, and that's how she identified, because she couldn't pull apart her identity from the disability. And that's true for me too. I can't pull apart having DID from who I am, because who I am is so much a part of having DID. So I'm not sure if that makes sense to folks, but okay. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit, just a little overview on deaf community. So some deaf and hard of hearing people do not identify as having a disability. they identify as a member of a cultural and linguistic group. And this group of people use the term deaf with a capital D to reflect their cultural identification. Deaf culture is defined by shared language, values, and history, and the experiences of deaf women are shaped by autism. So in the ways in which I explain my example of being, my experience of being a disabled person is shaped by ableism, how I've looked at myself as being less than, that is what the experience of deaf women are. So autism is the notion that one is superior based on one's ability to hear or to behave in the manner of one who hears, or that life without hearing is futile and miserable, or an attitude based on pathological thinking, which results in negative stigma toward anyone who does not hear. So you can take any disability and put that in there, and that would be ableism. So anyway, so there's this video I'd like to show you, and I'm hoping it'll work well. It's all, you'll have to watch because it's sign language and it's all captioned on the video. So I'm going to give you a second, if you're away from your screen and you're just listening to me, to come back, and then I'll start the video. So it's a really short video, well, you'll see what it is. I love it. Okay, so yeah, there was really very little sound in the video. I love that video, and I love the term deaf gang. So if you go back to what I was talking about being a person with DID and feeling less than, and having to try to make myself like deal with everything that happens inside me, but make myself look like I don't have DID. It's really similar. It's this feeling of being less than. And I have to say that today, if somebody told me that they could give me a pill and my DID would go away, I wouldn't want it. I love the way my brain works. I mean, I don't think I'd know what to do if my brain worked differently. But I'm not sure I would have said that when I was in my 30s or in my 40s. So it's taken me a really long time to get to a place where I really appreciate the values, the superpowers that I have. And this is, so this feeling that this video gives you, or the discussion that I'm kind of bringing to you, I'm hoping that you can center this. And when you're working with a person with a disability, look at them as just someone who is different, not less than, and actually might have some really amazing superpowers. And so then looking for those with them. Okay. So,
Olga.
Yeah.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh,
So
awesome.
someone asked, how would you suggest approaching someone with a disability when you're unsure if they want person first versus identity first?
Oh, yeah. You ask people how they identify. So you always use person first, unless someone tells you that they would prefer to be known like as identity first. So for example, there are people who, so let's take autism in particular, because that is a disability where people have found that it's difficult to separate themselves from the disability and are really kind of pushing the movement of identity first language. So they might be a person with autism, and that's the way anyone who does not have a disability would first talk about somebody with a disability, person first language, until they tell you that they consider themselves autistic, or identify as disabled. So for example, Lydia XZ Brown is a really amazing advocate who is autistic, and she uses identity first language, and her whole website and stuff is Autistic Hoya. Well, she teaches and works at Georgetown University, I think Georgetown Law School, in fact, which their mascot is the Hoya. So that's why her whole thing is about identity first. So the general rule would be you use people first language unless someone asks you to refer to them in identity first language, and then just ask them how you would do that. So I'm doing a training for a group in Vancouver, Canada in April, because they are finding trafficking survivors who are plural and who are identifying themselves as plural. And that is the way that someone with DID who is using identity first language. So again, I would always refer to someone as someone with DID unless they've told me that they prefer to be known as someone who's plural, or as, now I'm trying to figure out how to say this, plurality. So, okay, the grammar is going to mess me up, but I hope that answers the question. And Alexandra, any others, or are we good?
That's the only question that we have so far.
I actually
Awesome.
have one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
My name's Jessica, and I'm a youth intern at the Agri Coalition. I just have a question about how you approach the conversations about what accommodations, or I don't know, if you are finding that you need, or that your coworkers, are not respecting the accommodations that you need, how you navigate those conversations. I'm just, as a young person, I find it really intimidating to, you know, in my workplace. And I just wanted to know.
Yeah, totally. Okay. So, first, I'll start off with the fact that all the people I work with know I have DID, right? Because I do trainings on it. I wrote a book about it, all that stuff. So the first thing, Jessica, is you have to decide whether you want to disclose your disability. Okay. And I have lots of diagnoses that would be considered disability. So if a long time ago, I did not disclose that I had DID, and I told people one of the other diagnoses I had was PTSD. So what I did was I let my superior know that I have this disability. So I'll tell you what I did a long time ago, and I'll tell you what I do now. So a long time ago, when I didn't want people to know, and I was just following the law, because one, I'm a lawyer, and two, I'm an employment lawyer. So I knew what I had to ask for under the law, and I worked in the federal government. So I had told my superior that I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and that I need an accommodation. And that at the time, the accommodation I needed was to be able to leave in the middle of the day, a few days a week, to go to therapy and then come back. So I asked for a flexible work schedule that enabled me to do that. And that's because I was in the healing process. Now, like after going through all that, I just know that my brain works different. So what I do is I ask people, so because people in my office know, then I talk to my supervisor and I'm like, okay, so here's the way that my brain works. And this will be the easiest way for me to do this. Like, so I strategize with them about how I get my work done. So, so it's hard for me when people change things at the last minute. It's hard for me when I'm trying to think of things, because it's been a while since I've had anything that's been, oh, okay. It's hard for me when people are they talk, it's passion, but they talk like they're angry all the time. They like talk loudly and they challenge you, and then they say they're going to do something, but they forget. And that's probably the worst thing for me, is people say things and they do things and those things don't match up. So that's the hardest thing for me. So I've let the people I work with, the leadership in my organization, know that this is really hard for me. Like when people say things and they do something that's different. And so there's going to be time. So I ask people to just kind of try to pay attention to that, and that I will ask them when I notice it, but I didn't want to police it. I didn't want to be the person that was responsible for holding them accountable for doing the things that they said they're going to do. And that's tricky, because they then have to do that themselves. And I find most people can't. They'll say they can, and then they just can't. So I just ask them for things that I need. Like, if you could give me stuff ahead of time and not at the last minute, that'd be great, because then I'll be able to focus on it. Otherwise, I'll have this sense of panic. So I try to give people more information about why I'm asking for something. But you don't have to. You can just say, there are people that take medication that aren't able to start right at 9, that might need a later work schedule. There are people, I actually am the opposite. I start earlier and finish earlier. But those are the kinds of things. So think about what makes your work hard. And then think about what could you ask for that would make it easier? And what you're asking for, is what you're asking for reasonable? Meaning you're not asking them to renovate the building and it's going to cost them $100,000. You're asking them for a flexible work schedule, so you're still working your 40 hours a week, but it might look a little different. Or you're asking for people to plan so that they can give you things with enough time for you to get it done. Or when you are having to do something at the last minute and it might be hard for you, to have a thought partner in that. Does that make sense? Okay. Sure. And then let me know too if there's other specifics, okay? Because I think this is important for everybody. So you're just the one who's asking. All right. Okay, so implications of all that we just talked about, the statistics and everything. Language is incredibly important. We don't always think of it that way. And sometimes people who don't know will get nervous and they'll use like kind of inappropriate language and try to ignore it. And the best thing to do is just ask, wow, you know, it's been a long time since I've worked with anyone with a disability. And, you know, I just kind of want to know what's the best way to talk about your disability with you. What kind of accommodations do you need? You know, like just kind of try to be vulnerable and have humility, like learn. Just don't learn everything there is. Don't try to learn everything there is to know about people with disabilities from a survivor or a coworker. Do that work on your own, but ask them what's the best way to work with them. What do they need? What do they want? What kind of accommodations might be helpful for them? And there's some really good videos on our website, on the End Abuse of People with Disabilities website, and at the Vera Institute of Justice. We have some videos that show how you ask someone for accommodations. So it's a law enforcement officer asking someone, a lawyer asking someone, and an advocate asking someone. So it's just an example of how you would do that. Okay, so people with disabilities and deaf individuals must be involved in meaningful ways. Agencies should not rely on people self-identifying as people with disabilities to create access. You have to create access generally, or people will not come to your program. And because you haven't created access, you're basically telling people that you're not an accessible place. So if you're serious about serving survivors with disabilities, you have to look at how your program can be accessible. And it usually it's not physical accessibility that's the problem. It's usually attitudes that's the problem. So agencies must be flexible and customized to meet an individual's specific ability and needs. So there are things that you can do to make your program more accessible. So for example, you can make sure that you have ASL interpreters available. But it doesn't mean that every person, every deaf individual is going to need or want an ASL interpreter. Not all deaf individuals know ASL. So just as an example, you want to have accessibility, but then find out what that person needs. And to meet the full range of needs among people with disabilities and deaf peoples, agencies will need to address the full range of access issues, often through partnerships. And those partnerships are going to be with disability service providers. So disability organizations are used to doing, making things accessible for people with disabilities. And the thing that we recommend the most is having people partner in their community with those organizations. They can also help you figure out how you can make your program more accessible, and the Vera Institute can as well. Okay, so let's look in the research about abuse of people with disabilities. So the research is limited. And it's because there has been really limited funding around people with disabilities. And we have worked hard this year to try to get more funding through the Violence Against Women Act in the Disability Grants Program, which we believe that there will be appropriated this year, more money there. And also adding disability to the FIPSA program, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. So anybody who gets FIPSA funding can use that money to make their programs more accessible. And also there'll be a resource center once FIPSA passes, which we'll hope it passes. There'll be a resource center to provide training, technical assistance, and resources to programs that are trying to make their services more accessible. There already is for Violence Against Women Act, which is the Vera Institute of Justice. Okay, so there's limited research. Research that is there has documented that people with disabilities experience increased risk of violent victimization. Some people with disabilities experience increased risk of domestic and sexual violence when compared to people without disabilities. And you can't generalize findings to all people with disabilities. So, and I want to tell you that this number is actually higher now. So people with disabilities, up until when this report came out in November, it was people with disabilities were at 3 times greater risk to experience rape, sexual assault, aggravated assault, robbery than those without disabilities. But then in November, BJS released a new study that finds that people with disabilities are actually 4 times at greater risk of violent crime. And so this is why, and today, thank you so much, Savannah. Today is the Disability Day of Mourning. Exactly. This is why it feels really important to me to do this work and wanting to do this training and some of the other trainings that I've done for NC CASA. Is to help people understand that this group of marginalized people, and really where we're focusing our effort is not just on people with disabilities, but Black, Brown, and Indigenous and people of color with disabilities, because multiply marginalized people are at more risk than people who are not multiply marginalized. So Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color with disabilities are at higher risk of victimization than white people with disabilities. Okay, so the risk of violence is higher for certain people with disabilities, people with intellectual or cognitive disabilities, people with psychiatric disabilities, and people with multiple disabilities. And then women with disabilities are at higher risk, and people of color who have disabilities are at higher risk. And again, if you think about the intersections and you combine these identities, the risk gets even higher. All right, so women who have experienced intimate partner violence are more than twice as likely to also report a disability, oftentimes because of the violence. 14% of men with disabilities reported experiencing sexual violence at some point in their lifetime, compared to 4% of men without disabilities. That's a huge difference. 49% of people with developmental disabilities were assaulted 10 or more times. And 20% of deaf adults have experienced physical abuse by an intimate partner. 15% have experienced forced sex in an intimate partner relationship. So why is this happening? Like, why are they more at risk? Why are we more at risk? So one is a devaluation. There is a sense in our society that people with disabilities are less than. And so it's a little bit kind of like, you know, how we're talking about how, you know, the police respond differently to Black and brown people than they do to white people. Well, imagine that there is also, well, the police respond differently to people with disabilities, and people that are Black and brown with disabilities they are over policed, over incarcerated, and because there is less value in our society. Our society thinks about people like that as a, not individually, but as a society, we think about people like that as not having as much value. There's a presumption that they lack credibility, the isolation and segregation that happens to people with disabilities, increased exposure to potential abusers. So when someone has, when their partner is also their personal care attendant, they are at even higher risk. And then there's a culture of compliance. People with disabilities have been taught to be compliant as they have dealt with their physical or mental or sensory disabilities. And they are seen as easy targets. Our society even like there's lots of discussions and movies and all sorts of stuff. I mean, the R word is still being used in movies and in mainstream. Like I was listening to some podcasts from This American Life, and I'm still hearing the R word used, which is a really terrible word. People just don't know, and they don't think it's important to know. So who is responsible for the violence that happens to people with disabilities? So the relationship is usually, the people that cause harm are usually acquaintances, which is 40%. 15% are intimate partners. Then 10% are other relatives. So if you add that all up, that's 65% of the abuse that happens is people who know, related to, friends with, or care for the person with a disability. So not a lot different than the dynamics that we have generally around domestic violence and sexual assault, but worse because of the isolation and dependence. All right, so abuse of people with disabilities has unique dynamics. So these are different. These are also added things that happen in the lives of people with disabilities that is part of the abuse that you don't see as much in other intimate relationships. So withholding of medication, delaying or refusing to provide care, abusing or threatening to abuse a service animal, threatening to move a person to a nursing home or institution. The issue around independence for people with disabilities is huge. And it is a large part of why people don't report crimes that have happened to them. Okay, so I hope everybody's able to keep up. I hope I'm not going too fast. Okay, so reaching out and healing. So let's look at what the research tells us about people with disabilities. So significant underreporting. Violent crimes reported to police is 47%. Here's why. Silence feels safer and less harmful. People are afraid to lose independence, and they are really afraid of institutionalization. There is a lack of knowledge about healthy sexuality and safety, so they are not always aware that what's happened to them is a crime. They're afraid of losing autonomy. There is a lack of effective criminal justice response. The Vera Institute of Justice received 2 grants this past year to try to develop training and technical assistance for law enforcement and prosecutors on how to respond, like more effective responses for victims, for survivors with disabilities. Anyway, it's really needed. and I just want to say, because I'm one of those people that kind of feels a little challenged about working with law enforcement when we're seeing so much stuff that's happening. But I feel that there are people who want a law enforcement response. And for those people, I really want law enforcement to know how to work with them. And I mean, the statistics are that 50% of the people who've been harmed by law enforcement are people with disabilities. So there's a lot of work to do. Okay, so the lack of effective criminal justice response, and don't know how to report or reach out for help. A lot of people have never been taught, don't know anything about that, and don't know anything about their rights even, or the language that they should use. So victim services are out of reach. Only 12% of victims of violent crime with disabilities ever receive support from victim services. So domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, or victim service providers in law enforcement, prosecution across the board. Only 12%. And I have to tell you that a lot of that is not helpful services, because they don't know enough. Their programs aren't accessible. So barriers to victim services is limited. No specialized outreach to survivors with disabilities, so they don't know. Physical, communication, programmatic, and attitudinal barriers in anti-violence programs. So that's what I was saying. It's people think that complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, is too expensive, but really it's more attitudinal than it is physical remodeling. There's a lot that can be done to give people with wheelchairs in wheelchairs access, but there's so much more that can be done for people who who don't have mobility issues, but the programs aren't accessible. And that's an attitudinal change that needs to happen. Lack of specialized knowledge and response protocols to survivors and disability organizations is also a barrier to service, and lack of coordination between anti-violence and disability organizations is also, so when you partner with a disability organization, they're going to help people with disabilities know who to reach out to if they're victimized. And they're going to help you, they're going to coordinate with you in terms of access. You'll learn a lot from those programs, and they'll also learn a lot from you, because a lot of them don't know anything about the work we do, meaning advocates. Okay, and justice is out of reach for many. Violent crimes reported to the police are 47%. People charged with an offense is, so if the victim is a person with a disability, 47% of the time, they might report the crime. Then of that 47%, 22% of the people who caused the crime are charged, and only 9% are convicted. In the work that I'm doing a needs assessment right now on prosecutors and cases that were taken and prosecuted, and I'm finding very, very little information available. So barriers to justice is and this is in large part what's going on with our prosecutors in courts. There's a perceived lack of credibility if the person has a disability. There's a lack of accommodation. So usually our service providers, like our domestic violence, our sexual assault, human trafficking services, are the ones that are most accessible. And then when you get to law enforcement or prosecution or courts, it's less accessible. So if we think that only 12% of victims are reaching out to service providers, and most of those services are not accessible or not helpful, then think about what it must be like with law enforcement, prosecution, and courts. So they don't know, and they don't have access to accommodations. And there is very little training for law enforcement or prosecutors on this. Okay, so other things to consider. So this is other things to consider, but these are really significant things that weighs on people with disabilities. So there are laws across the US that are mandatory reporting laws for vulnerable adults, and people with disabilities are considered vulnerable adults. So if a service provider is a mandatory reporter and they find out that something's going on, they have to report it, and that person could lose their independence. There are guardianship laws across the country where people will lose the right to control their own lives, control their access to meds, to really like anything. And that is frightening to people, is to lose their independence and have a guardian appointed. And oftentimes in intimate partner relationships, it's the guardian that's doing the harm. Consent and people with cognitive disabilities and the law is really challenging. There isn't really much in place that that prosecutors have done to make it easier for people with cognitive disabilities to be involved. And there's also the notion that people with cognitive disabilities cannot consent to having sexual relationships. And so then any kind of relationship that they have with someone, any kind of sexual relationship that they might actually engage in consensually with someone could be taken by a guardian and charged, meaning that they can call, kind of a little bit like statutory rape, they can call the police saying that this happened, that rape happened because that person with a disability does not have the ability to consent. So I hope that makes sense. So deaf survivors, it's a very small, tight-knit community. So let me just kind of give you an idea of what our services are across the country. There are about 3,000 service providers across the country. And there's probably more than that, but these are the ones that we know of. And when I mean service providers, I mean domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and also other kinds of victim service providers. I can't think of an example right now, but okay, so there's 3,000 across the country. There are 22 deaf programs across the country, 22. And those are by deaf, for deaf communities. So it's a very small, tight-knit community. The confidentiality is very hard to maintain because the community is so small, and they have what they refer to as a deaf grapevine, meaning that people will find out what's happened to them. And if someone in the community is causing harm to someone else in the community, the power dynamics there of losing your community is very, it's huge. It's worse to lose your community than to put up with what's happening to you. All right, so Alexandra, are we good on questions and stuff?
Yeah, we are good on questions for now.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let me go through then, and let's talk about how you can create a welcoming and accessible healing services and supports. Now, I did another webinar for NC CASA that I think you have the recording for, which was working with people with mental health or psychiatric disabilities. And I have a lot of slides in that one talking about some of the things you can do. I would encourage you to take a look at that. And if you don't have an opportunity to take a look at it, let me know and I can email you the PowerPoint, because I have a lot of suggestions in that one, really concrete suggestions that I did not incorporate in this one because it just would become too long. So I would recommend that you get that PowerPoint and just look at it. It's very, very concrete about some of the things that you can do. Okay. So start a dialogue. How has disability and deafness intersected in the work of the organization and its staff? So start kind of thinking in your program how this has shown up in your organization. Is your organization serving survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors? And if not, why not? And my guess is because they don't think that you're accessible. And if you are serving survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors, and you know it, then I want to know why you are, and you want to know why you are, because you're doing something right. Assuming that the services are meeting their needs, and that would be the other thing you'd want to know. Okay, so this would be a really nice discussion to have in a staff meeting, or if you guys have brown bag lunches, just to start kind of figuring out who is coming to your programs. What are the biggest barriers or challenges when providing advocacy and other services for these survivors? So one of the things, for example, so this is again, all part of a dialogue that you should be having in your organization. But one of the things that we've done at Vera is that, and what we're hoping to do at Vera is to create a national ASL helpline, basically, because we have access to ASL interpreters all the time, and to help people find those interpreters and access those interpreters. So that's something that we're trying to do. But in the meantime, the national hotline has a subcontract with a group out in Washington State who does their ASL interpreting for their hotline. And actually, I'm not sure if it's ASL interpreting, but who has the deaf hotline, and it's a deaf program. Okay, so then what do you need by way of support to address those barriers and challenges? So let's say it's really hard to find ASL interpreters, and that's preventing you from making your programs more accessible to deaf survivors. So then trying to find out how you can find deaf ASL interpreters in your area would be the thing to do. And you can start with us at Vera, and we can, guide you to the programs around the country that are deaf, by deaf people, for deaf people, and if there's any in your area. And then it might be that we can help you with identifying. Oh, thanks, Deanna. So NC CASA's language line for its members also includes access to ASL interpreters. That's awesome. Okay, so the key is, though, it might be, so you have places to reach out. So your coalition is a good place to go. Going to any deaf programs in your area is a great place to go. And then if you need more information, we have a lot of information at the Vera Institute. Okay. Now, another thing that you can do, which we help people do, and we have actually a form, a process that you can follow, is to conduct an accessibility review. So there are legal requirements to things that you have to do under the Americans with Disabilities Act, under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and under the Fair Housing Act. And because programs get federal funding, you have to comply with these, but a lot of people don't. So there are requirements to this, and there is a way of doing this, which is universal design. So there are things that you can do across your programs that will help multiple types of disabilities. And I talked about this when I talked about people with psychiatric disabilities, because there's a lot that you can do that's trauma informed that you all do already, that you just tweak, and it is great for people with psychiatric disabilities, intellectual disabilities, sensory disabilities. So the scope is, you're going to look at your physical environment, you're going to look at policy and practice environment, you're going to look at your communications environment, your information environment, and your training environment. So you are looking at all those pieces to figure out whether you have accessibility, whether you are providing accessibility. And we have a lot of resources to help with that. You want to, in doing the access review, you want to understand your strengths and areas of improvement. So some of the questions that you would ask is, can people with disabilities get to you and navigate your space easily? So, you know, is it like, are you accessible? Is your building accessible? Or is there a way for people to know how to get into your building if your building starts with a bunch of stairs? Are your materials accessible? And this is like plain language, like having things in accessible or plain language is what I'm talking about here. So, and one of the best ways to do this is, there are a couple organizations. There's the ASAN, the Autistic Self-Advocate Network has done a lot to put materials into plain language. And you can also pay them to put things into plain language. And then there's another group that is, I don't remember the name of it, but is run by Lydia XZ Brown, Autistic Hoya, that also puts, especially legalese, Lydia's a lawyer, into plain language, which is a huge job. And you can hire them to do that. But getting your materials into plain language is how you would start making your materials accessible. Also, you can use pictorial guides, and then you don't have to worry about the actual literacy or language. Do you have the knowledge and comfort needed to effectively support survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors? Like, do you know enough about what you're doing to feel confident interacting with folks and helping make your programs more accessible? If not, then reach out for training and technical assistance, build partnerships with disability organizations. And can people with disabilities and deaf people see themselves in your work? Do they feel welcome and included? That's huge. Where was I recently? I was talking to somebody and they said, oh, we don't have any people with disabilities in our area, which I find shocking. I don't think that's true. And I was like, well, how do you know? And they said, well, because no one's ever come in to their program. And I'm like, yeah, that's not really how that works. If your program is not accessible, people will not come. They won't try to come in unless they're desperate to come in. And, you know, given all the things that weigh against reporting or access, you've got to make your programs accessible if you want to be able to serve people with disabilities and deaf people. Okay. So the access review continued. You create a plan for addressing these barriers and you prioritize. Barriers to the most essential services are some of the easiest ways to start. Identify areas where you need additional resources and knowledge. And then again, you want to partner with disability and deaf organizations. And these are some of the organizations that are at the state level. Each state has an ARC, deaf and hard of hearing commissions, mental health associations. I think NAMI, the National Association of Mental Illness, is also in every state. Protection and advocacy organizations and state independent living centers. Those are all possibilities for engaging with. It might be something good to do from the coalition level. And then at the local level, there are ARC local chapters. There are boards of developmental disabilities. There are community mental health providers One of the best places that I like is community behavioral health. And those are community-based mental health providers. They're great resources to look into for partnering. Deaf service providers, deaf-specific domestic violence programs, independent living centers again, and interpreter agencies are also really helpful. And then create meaningful opportunities for people with disabilities and deaf people. So engage us in your work. Don't do work about us without us. So if you have people in your community, whether it's a partnership with another organization, as you're doing your accessibility review, as you're thinking about how you make your programs more accessible, as you think about how you make your services, that your interactions with people more accessible, engage those people with disabilities in your community that are doing this work. Include self-advocates and other people with disabilities in the work you do to address abuse of people with disabilities. Build relationships with local self-advocacy chapters and or disability organizations to find self-advocates to include. And be careful how you do this. If you do involve people, if you decide to start revamping how you do things or kind of do an assessment of how you're doing things, and you want to involve people with disabilities, don't just involve one person with a disability as kind of a token person. Involve as many people as you can with disabilities, meaning it's easier if you involve people with different disabilities to your working groups, not just one person, but as many people with disabilities as there are without disabilities. So it's not just one person carrying the burden. It's the same way that you would do racial equity work. You wouldn't invite one Black person or one person of color to be part of an equity work group because that's tokenizing. So it's the same for people with disabilities. So try to have as many people with disabilities as people without. And then provide full support and ensure full participation. So meaning that if you bring people into your meetings, you then need to make your meetings accessible. You want them to be able to participate as fully. And so you want to ask them what they need in order to participate fully. If you're bringing deaf people in, you're going to need ASL interpretation. So make sure that you build for that, budget for it, and plan for it. Things take a little bit longer because you have to set things in place. And then finally, proactively account for access. So you can't do this work unless you budget for it. So find out if your organization is budgeting for this. Identify organizations that can help you meet your accommodation requests ahead of time. Sign language interpreter agencies, CART providers, the Braille House, and again, Centers for Independent Living. Put policies in place to guide staff in the moment. Integrate disability awareness into existing training for new and existing staff. And explore attitudes towards people with disabilities on your staff, within your leadership, on your board, all of it. And I know that not all of you are in positions to do this, but I'm hoping that you can bring this information to your organization and start a dialogue about how your organization can be more accessible as they're being more equitable. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Cool. So questions, comments? So there's stuff in the chat, but I haven't kept up, Alexandra, so I don't know exactly where to.
Yeah, I'm happy to read out some of the comments that we've gotten so far.
Oh, cool. Thank you. That'd be awesome.
Samantha said the reasoning that I have seen the identity first language is also that the common experience of disabled people is not having any of the disabilities that you listed, because there are so many and they are so diverse, but our common shared experience of being disabled by a society rooted in ableism.
Yeah, wow, that's awesome. Okay, you should do this training. That's exactly right. And also wanted to point out that people with different types of disabilities, intellectual disabilities, are using the term neurodivergent, which, so people whose brains work differently are using the term neurodivergent, which I love. I don't know, it just feels kind of very empowering. So I use that as well for the fact that my brain works differently. So anyway, just wanted to toss that in there into the mix. Okay.
Deanna, I wanted to thank you for bringing this up, and that it's especially mostly come to people's attention recently because of Britney Spears' conservatorship case.
Oh yeah, that's actually the way that has kind of come up in the media has been really awesome for people with disabilities, and for the disability movement. It's really amazing that someone of such celebrity, of such wealth, could have been put under a conservatorship. Just shows you the deviousness of her father, just really honestly.
And then the last comment that was in there is also from Deanna, that the NC CASA language line is for members and also includes access to ASL interpreters, and in-person services can be arranged when there is advance notice. And
Awesome.
We just now have a question. So do you have recommendations for protecting clients with disabilities from abuse while protecting them from the state?
I know, right? Yeah, so so this is where kind of disability justice comes in. And I haven't talked a lot about disability justice, but disability justice is looking at kind of transformative justice, so alternatives to our systems responses, because our systems responses can cause so much harm. And this is where the disability field is kind of looking to, because there are so many different ways that people with disabilities can be harmed through systems. Now some people really want a system response. And the best thing I would say there is recognize that most people, especially most of the system providers, are going to be mandated reporters. And to have kind of a strategy with that person with the disability around how to talk about what happened, how to move forward with the fact that somebody might be a mandated reporter. And are there people in that person's life that they're worried is going to try to take control over their independence, try to get guardianship, any of those pieces? So I would have those discussions really early on. And you have to be careful how you do this, because you don't want to discourage people from using systems that they really want access to, but you want them to know the potential pitfalls to our systems right now. And as we try to get, this is an issue. Our group is trying to develop a policy agenda that we can start really, we've been working on policy issues for a long time, but we're trying to be more assertive, more active with a policy agenda to try to get national attention, more national attention on some of these issues, like, for example, guardianship or conservatorship that the Britney Spears case has done. So one of the things is that Senator Duckworth is a woman of color with a disability who really wants to showcase, who really wants to triumph disability issues. So we're working with her staff to try to identify some of the pitfalls. And the biggest challenge is ableism. So even people who have disabilities see that mandatory reporting, think that mandatory reporting is good for people with disabilities. So I guess my answer is it's tricky. Make sure that people know what to expect and then have a strategy for moving forward. And try to limit what system people know to what they really need to know. Awesome. Okay. So other questions, comments? I can't believe I got through all those slides, and we still have time.
Feel free to also unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment or anything.
And you can turn your camera on if you want. Oh, I'm not at the same time. Cool. All right. Well, I think it's okay if we end a little early, right? Give people like 15 minutes of their day back.
Yeah, go and take a walk or something, use those last 15 minutes to do something nice for yourself.
Yeah, get out there in your sunshiny 60, 70 degree weather while I'm excited to get out in 33-degree weather. And then remember that my email address is at olga@olgatrujillo.com. So if you have questions, or if you want a copy of that other PowerPoint that I mentioned about working with people with psychiatric disabilities, let me know and I'm happy to send that to you. I'm happy to email back and forth with you. Thank you so much. Also, this is my last NC CASA webinar. I think I've done like 10. So thank you so much to Deanna and to Alexandra. And I'm sorry that I missed saying goodbye to, oh my God, to Leah. Here we go. But it's been really an honor and a joy to do these with you all. And thank you for those of you who have been. I recognize some of the names and faces. Thanks for coming back. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone. I will send a follow-up email after this with any sort of information and resources that we have to share with you. So I hope you all have a good rest of your afternoon. Bye, everyone.